there, my name is Julie Dostal and I'm the Executive Director of the Leaf Council on Alcoholism and Addictions that is housed in Oneonta, and we cover Otsego and Shenango counties. Our agency is responsible for prevention services for both of those counties, and so I've been working in prevention for a little over 25 years. And that's the reason that I'm really happy to be able to bring this particular talk to Scouting University for the Leatherstocking Council. I am also a member of the district committee and very pleased to be so. So I'm hoping that you've possibly watched the video that I did on addiction and young people. That would be a really good background to watch before talking specifically about vaping cannabis in the developing brain. I want to talk to you about a particular obstacle, risk that our young people are facing today, and they are facing it at greater and greater risk over time, mainly because cannabis has been legalized in our state. It will become more available to them, and it will become more visible in our culture. So I want to talk to you a little bit about that. And as you know, young people are highly drawn to vaping for a different reason. And let me just talk a little bit about why young people vape. We're going to talk about this because kids tend to be vaping in higher and higher numbers. We want to keep an eye on this. And if you are an adult who cares for young people, if you are a parent who has a teen or a tween, then I first of all want to say to you, vaping is not harmless. Vaping causes harm to both a person's body and to a person's brain. And so I'm going to put that right on the table so that you know the perspective that I'm coming from. And I am, and the work that we do, my colleagues are concerned about young people's exposure to vaping. Whether it's tobacco, whether it's nicotine or whether it's cannabis. The exposure to vaping is of concern. So let's talk about why do teens vape. There were some surveys that were done to talk to kids about why you vape. Some high schools report that up to 50% of their students are vaping, and I'm not talking about local high schools, I'm just talking about in general. Some high schools report that 15% of their young people are vaping. Depending on the size of the high school, that's a lot of young people that are vaping. Vaping is all the rage on college campuses as well. So these are things that we need to be aware of. And so not only is it in the culture, there are reasons that teens vape. First of all, a friend or family member vapes. A lot of adults started vaping actually to try to wean themselves off of cigarettes. And then the vape took the place of the cigarettes. And so a lot of teens see the family or friend vaping. About 39% of them say they do it because a family member does it. The available flavors is another reason that young people vape. About 31% of teens said we vape because it tastes good. And that's the reason they do it. And then there is a belief that e-cigarettes are less harmful than other ways of smoking. So about 17% of young people say that e-cigarettes are less harmful, and that's the reason that they vape. And I just want to add a little note. Vaping also feels good. And teens look for opportunities to have sensations. They're very high sensation seekers typically. And so vaping nicotine, vaping cannabis makes them feel good. So besides the fact that friends or families vape, besides the fact that the flavors taste good, or besides the fact that they think they're doing something safe, it feels good. So what do teens say are in their e-cig? That 66% of them think that it's just flavoring. And nearly all of the e-cigs or the vapes on the market right now have nicotine in them. And 66% of you just think that it is flavoring. Second, about 13% think it's nicotine. Another 13% don't know what's in it. Some of them believe that it's marijuana. Some people think it's other. But most of the young people think that it is just flavoring. So let's talk about what vaping looks like in high school. These are the latest high school data that we have from 2014 to 2021. Lately, about 3.1% of teens vape every day nationally, and about 8.2% vape casually and frequently. So the national average is about 11.3. Why do they vape? They think vaping is sexy. So if you take a look, they say, is smoking sexy? Oh no. About 65% say no, smoking is not sexy. Don't watch movies in the 50s or 60s. Is vaping sexy? Oh yes. 69% of them think that vaping is sexy. So one of the kids are all about the way things look. Kids are all about their friend group, and if they look cool to their friend group, then 65% of them say smoking is an oh no, vaping is an oh yes when it comes to looking, feeling sexy. So that's important when we talk to young people about vaping. As a matter of fact, in conversations with young people, we do not deny their point of view. And we also are really honest with them about the fact that it feels good, and we know it feels good. Because if we come at them about all the terrible news, they're not going to listen to us. We have to at least acknowledge that they think it looks cool, and we have to at least acknowledge that it feels good or they wouldn't do it. Then we can tell them about the reality of their health. One of the things I wanted to be able to show you today is, in order to identify vaping, we need to be able to identify vapes. Vapes come in every shape or size. So let's look here. This is a sweatshirt, and you see that little handle hanging down right there? That's a vape pen on the end of the sweatshirt. See this Sharpie? That's a vape pen. They can be found online, they can be ordered online. See this backpack over here? It's got a vape pen hanging down in the strap. And if you take a look at this inhaler right here, that looks like a normal asthma inhaler. And that's a vape. So it is important for those of us who work with young people, if we talk about helping young people and taking a look at what they're doing, we need to know what vapes look like. And so I'm going to suggest that when we're done with this conversation, that you just go online and Google concealed vaping items and just take a look at what's available. And believe me, if I can find it and you can find it, our young people can find it. It's out there. So just educate yourself on what different vape devices look like. It's important. So how to detect vaping? It is not easy to detect vaping. And one of the reasons it's not easy, because sometimes we don't even know what it looks like. We think that it's going to look like the pen or the container that they vape with, but sometimes there are ways to conceal it. And if we're not aware of that, if we see them chewing on the end of their string on their hoodie, it might not be that they're just chewing on the end of the string of their hoodie. Notice any new or sweet smells. So if you have a young person that comes in for a meeting or into the troop or comes back from a walk in the woods and they smell like something that they wouldn't normally smell like, that might be the smell of a vape on their clothing. If there are behavioral changes, now we're going to talk a little bit in just a minute about how quickly a person can become addicted to nicotine, and it can happen unbelievably quick. And if a young person has been vaping, especially if they don't know that there is anything in the vape, they think they're just vaping water, they just think they're vaping flavor, they could be addicted to nicotine and not know it, go to school, follow the rules because they're not going to vape in school, And by the end of the day, they start having nicotine withdrawal and sometimes aren't even aware of it. They get edgy, they get frustrated, they get short with their temper. That's what nicotine withdrawal looks like. And so if that kind of, or say they go on an overnight with you, or say they go on a weekend with you and vapes are not available, if nicotine withdrawal happens, there will be behavioral responses to that nicotine withdrawal. Watch for swapping items. So if you see young people swapping things that don't make sense, so say they've got a Sharpie in their hand, or say they've got an asthma inhaler in their hand, and they're swapping those with kids, and you know that that's not something that would normally be swapped. Or if you see another kid chewing on the string of somebody else's hoodie, that's not normal behavior. So watch for those kinds of things, because vaping may be in progress and we don't even see it. And finally, there are, if you're in an indoor setting, there are some electronic detection devices that can be utilized to detect vaping in the air, like some schools do it in restrooms and things like that. I think that those electronic detection devices, they're kind of like smoke alarms for vaping. I think those have been met with mixed results, but if you wanted to look them up to look and see if that's something that needed to be installed on an indoor setting, do your research on those. Some people find them effective, some people find them ineffective. That would be completely up to you. So, how addictive is nicotine? And I'm going to tell you that addiction to nicotine is the greatest challenge of vaping. And I would love to, what I'm going to do is describe to you about what it feels like to need nicotine. And this is based on work done by Joseph DeFranza, and he's from the University of Massachusetts Medical School. So he did this work, and I want to share with you his work because it made perfect sense to me. I'm an ex-smoker. I remember what it felt like to need nicotine, and I remember what it felt like to not have it and to feel like I was jonesing for a cigarette. So I'm going to share with you what his research says, because this is important for our young people. If you watch the other video, you find that our young people have brains that aren't developed yet until they're 25 to 28. And so interactions of a chemical with that undeveloped, not mature, whatever word you want to say, brain, has extreme effects that might not be so extreme for a person with a fully developed brain, an adult. So wanting is the first stage of nicotine dependence. And let me tell you what wanting feels like. It feels like there's this kind of transient, kind of passing by desire to use nicotine. You kind of feel it. You haven't had a vape for a while. It will go away and can easily be ignored. So that's what wanting feels like. It's kind of like, oh yeah, I want a vape. I want to go get a draw of a vape. I'm okay. I can do without it right now. That's wanting. The next one is craving. So craving is actually more intense than wanting. And what it begins to do when you have a craving for nicotine is it starts to intrude on your thoughts. So if you decide to make yourself busy rather than go and have a vape, so if you want to make yourself busy by trying to cook dinner or do your homework or play a game, what will happen is that craving will begin to nudge in on those thoughts and be like, you really need a cigarette, or you really need a vape, you really want a vape, boy, could I use a vape. And it's very hard to concentrate on other things. It is persistent and difficult to ignore. And so young people wrote these sentences. One says, I feel like somebody's inside of me really telling me to smoke, being pushed to vape from inside. The other teen says, it's like just pops into your head and something is sending you a message. That's what craving feels like. Finally, needing. So we've got wanting, craving, needing. It is an intense and urgent desire. I gotta have it right now. I need it right now. I feel it. My chest, my heart's gonna pop out of my chest if I don't have it right now. That is needing. There's a physical push that is impossible to ignore. Now, can people get past that? They can, but they can't ignore it. It's real. In order to make the feeling go away and get relief, taking a drag off of a vape or using a vape or having a cigarette is the way to make that go away, because it's a physical response to having a lower level of nicotine in your brain that you're used to having. So let's talk about, it's called latency, that's the fancy word. It's really the time between your last use, so if we're going to talk about vaping, your last vape, and when you're going to feel like you need something else. So the latency period between wanting, craving, and needing. So let's look at, say, a 16-year-old. Notice that the latency craving was about 2 days. So a 16-year-old who's using, not using a lot, using very mildly, they can go about 2 days without feeling like they need to have another one. If they continue using and continue using a little bit more, that period between last use and craving at 17 would be 2 hours. They continue using, at 18 it would be 1.5 hours. At 19 it would be 1 hour. And down to about 30 minutes when they're 21. So continuing to use nicotine does nothing but shorten the period of time that you go from using the substance to craving the substance. And here are some of the behavioral indicators. So if you have a young person that is using and then for some reason they're separated from their vape, so you're doing a group activity, you go camping, you have an all-day event, and they are not able to get to their vape, here are some things that you would see. Restlessness, anxiety, irritability, anger, difficulty concentrating, and disturbed sleep. So especially on overnights, you would see this, that the person is tossing and turning, they're feeling anxious. And if you have had a person with you for 2-hour events or half days and you haven't seen this, and they're not, the young person is not necessarily having homesickness or any of those kind of away from home anxieties, it might be that what's really happening is they're having nicotine withdrawal and don't really even know that. Now here is I put this in big letters, this next slide. So this is important. The nicotine in one vape pod can equal the nicotine in 20 cigarettes. So if you see a young person with their vape with the pod, that pod can have the nicotine of up to 20 cigarettes. That's important to know. So that's a pack. That's a pack of cigarettes. And if a kid goes through 3 vape pods, which is not unusual, a day, then they've essentially been a 3-pack-a-day smoker as far as the nicotine level. And, you know, a lot of adults don't even know this. That if they're using a vape, that the nicotine in the vape pod is so concentrated that it equals that much nicotine as in 20 cigarettes. And what the neuroscience shows is that the nicotine, this is important, this is like good brain. Now I'm a little bit of a brain nerd, so can you just be nerdy with me for just a second? So the nicotine from one cigarette occupies 88% of the brain's nicotinic receptors. So we all have these receptors. They work for us. They're there for a reason. They help our brains work. One cigarette occupies 88% of those receptors. One dose stimulates an increase in the number of those receptors in one night. So here's the thing, they're wonderful little receptors. They do a fantastic job for us. One cigarette occupies 88%, and then overnight, the brain goes, oh my goodness, we need more of those receptors. And overnight, more of those receptors are created, making more space for more nicotine. Are you with me? Okay. One dose initiates drug sensitization. Now, in the other talk that I just did, we talked about in terms of tolerance. So one dose initiates tolerance, and tolerance is needing more of the same drug to get the same effect. So if I got a little bit of a relief feeling from one cigarette today, I may need 2 cigarettes tomorrow, or one vape, say 3 puffs of a vape today did it for me. Tomorrow it may be 6 puffs of a vape that has nicotine in it. Neurological changes in addiction can begin with the first dose of nicotine. It is that addictive. It is that impactful on our brains. And remember, young people don't have fully developed brain yet. So it is even more impactful. In other words, addiction to nicotine through vaping happens very quickly. So if you think about that process, having nicotine lands on the receptors, the brain says, oh my goodness, it almost completely filled my receptors, I need more receptors. That means the next time you have 2 cigarettes, it lands on more receptors, and then the brain says, I need more of those receptors. And so the brain is kind of designed to be addicted to nicotine, or actually, nicotine is kind of designed to create that addiction. So with young people, I'm going to make a little transition here to cannabis and talking about how cannabis has begun to impact our young people. So nicotine is often the first thing that kids will vape. And a lot of times to teenagers, tweens, vaping is vaping is vaping. It's just vaping. And they see it in our culture as just vaping. And that transition to marijuana is often because we tend to have mixed messages about marijuana in our culture. Oh, it's safe. Oh, it's a medicine. People take it for medical purposes. If the doctor can recommend it, it must be safe. CBD can't hurt me. And we have seen lots and lots in the news about CBD. And I will tell you that a lot of people, young people, do not know the difference between CBD, which doesn't create a high. CBD may have some medicinal purposes, to THC, which is the psychoactive substance in cannabis. THC is the part that makes you high. CBD does not make you high. Now, some young people think that CBD makes you high, so therefore, if they believe they're getting high, they feel high. Placebo, it works. So here are some things that we've seen in our culture that CBD has been credited with treating: anxiety, inflammation, insomnia, pain, epilepsy, migraines, acne, blood pressure. Teens confuse these messages with all cannabis products, whether they are CBD or whether they are THC. And really to them, it's not important whether it's CBD or THC. So that's important. Now, even though CBD has been credited with being able to positively impact or help cure or treat, depending on what you read, these particular conditions, there's only one that there is super good research on and that has scientific evidence, and that's epilepsy. That's the only one that there is really good, solid, gold standard scientific evidence. Now it may do some of these other things, but the one thing that they're really comfortable saying that it can treat, CBD, is epilepsy. So let me tell you a little bit, so that's CBD. Let me tell you a little bit about THC, which is today's cannabis. This is the cannabis that has been just legalized for recreational use in New York State. And a lot of folks are not aware that the kind of cannabis that is available today is very, very different than the kind of cannabis that was available when either we were young people or our parents were young people. It's a very different animal. So let's talk about this. Today's cannabis is highly, highly concentrated. So back in the 60s and 70s, cannabis was 3 to 6%. Cannabis had 3 to 6% THC in it. And now, depending on what state that you're in, there are ways to produce products that have up to a 99% pure THC concentration in it. And I'm going to tell you that anything with a concentration like that is not weed. It's a different animal. It may be cannabis, but it's not. When our culture thinks of weed, they tend to think of people rolling a joint and smoking a joint, and that weed from the 60s and 70s, that was about 3 to 6% THC. However, now cannabis is sold in multiple forms: edibles, concentrates, vapes, bud, tinctures, and topicals. THC can be purchased in. And there are various levels of concentration. You know, like bud can be bought up to the teens now. You can buy just regular old weed at 16, 18% or higher. But if you go into the edibles, the concentrates, the vapes, the bud, the tinctures, any of those things, then the concentrates can go up to 50, 60%. And then there are some products in some states that go up to 99% THC. That is a huge concentration of THC that can hit a young person's brain at one time. So it's important for us as an adult to make sure how we characterize cannabis these days, because as adults we tend to romanticize the way that cannabis was used back in the day. And right now the levels of potency that's out there are very, very harmful to young people's brain. So let's talk about the impact on the youth brain development. So there are short-term effects. So if a young person is a very rare user, things that can happen is that it begins to lower their motivation level. They're kind of chill. They don't want to do anything, that kind of stuff. They can begin to have impaired memory after 1 or 2 or 3 uses. They can have lower desires to be social. They want to be using the substance more than they want to be active with their peers, especially if their peers are not peers that also use cannabis. And increased depression and suicidal thoughts can happen after cannabis use, even 1 or 2 uses. It just depends on how it impacts the brain of the young person. And finally, if the young person has used cannabis over time, even if it's not frequent, but over time, a young person can have withdrawal symptoms when it's not used. Now, longer-term effects, when a young person is using fairly regularly, they use over the course of months or years, there can be other impacts on brain development. So what I told you about nicotine and vaping and the development of more of these receptors, that's a different impact of vaping than, say, vaping cannabis over a long period of time. So what they find from people who vape over a long period of time is there can be a lower IQ in adulthood. Learning and memory impairment can be long-lasting, if not permanent. Altered responses to pleasure and stress. So for a person who has used cannabis over a very long period of time, vapes cannabis or eaten cannabis or however they choose to have it, what can happen is that it takes a great deal to trigger that pleasure response that I talked about in the brain. That gets altered. There can be, and this is probably one of the scariest things that they're seeing in the data right now, there can be an increased risk for psychosis, including schizophrenia. So if a person is consuming cannabis, they can have a psychotic episode, especially these high potency cannabis, they can have a psychotic episode. And there is a lot of research being done right now to find out if that psychosis can turn into permanent schizophrenia, which is a long-term debilitating mental health disorder. So we're very concerned about that, especially when we talk about cannabis on the developing brain. And then finally, what we see is people who use cannabis over the long term can also be at high risk for dependency of other drugs. So the bottom line when it comes to vaping is that they have different risks, whether a person is vaping nicotine or the person is vaping cannabis. Both of those are risks to the developing brain, and both of those have their impacts on a young person's life, whether it be withdrawal from nicotine and all of those effects that we talked about from withdrawal from nicotine, or it can be from the long-term impacts on the brain of cannabis related to motivation, learning, memory, and mental health. And what I'm going to leave you with is just remember 25. The young person's brain is not fully developed until 25. So any chemicals, any drugs, any substance that is introduced into the youth brain prior to it being fully developed has the significant impact that it might not have on an adult that would be using the same thing. And so it's important for us to remember that when we're working with young people. And again, if you know of a young person that is struggling with vapes, that is struggling with cannabis, it is important for you to know that you don't have to deal with that struggle alone. There are people who can help you, people who can support you, and people who can walk this road with you, whether that is your family doctor, whether that is a school social worker, or whether it is a person like me that works in a prevention agency at LEAF, or whether it is another leader. You do not have to walk this walk alone. There are ways to help our young people. There are ways to help them walk through this, and you can walk through it with them. The stigma related to seeking help for addiction is much diminished than the way it used to be. And there is help, and we can support our young people by being very aware of this thing that is in their environment. And if you're aware of it and you can be their supporter and their cheerleader, they are less likely to engage. Thank you.